Hi, everyone. I'm Lana Zak. Thank you for joining us. China has proposed a new law that could end any dream of democracy for Hong Kong. Scuffles broke out in Hong Kong's legislature on Friday when pro-democracy members protested the bill. The proposed law comes after last year's widespread anti-government demonstrations over a proposed extradition law. For more on this, I'm joined by Shibani Mahtani. She is the Southeast Asia correspondent for The Washington Post. Shibani, thank you for joining us. Can you please explain why this national security law is being implemented and what impacts it could have on Hong Kong?
Sure. So this is something that Beijing has wanted for Hong Kong for some time now. They had been pushing for these national security legislations since basically the handover in 1997. But I think it was always assumed that it would go through Hong Kong's legislature somehow. But what Beijing has done here is totally upended that process. So they will be implementing this now by decree. It's a very sweeping law. It will essentially criminalize foreign interference, having connections with foreign political parties. It will criminalize secession, so seeking independence for Hong Kong, and anything that's considered a threat to the Chinese state and Chinese national security. I think the real concern here is that this is so far-reaching, and as we know from the way activists and sort of dissidents have been treated in mainland China, it really could mean sort of the end for the freedoms that Hong Kong has known and cherished for generations.
For generations, right. The national security law, as you mentioned, is in response to last year's protests. Can you go ahead and remind us more about those protests, what happened, and how the coronavirus has affected them?
Yeah, so last June, actually, protests erupted here over an extradition law, which would have basically allowed, criminals charged here in Hong Kong to be extradited over to the mainland. That was very, very concerning to people because Hong Kong has a very respected system of rule of law. It's still very highly respected courts, and the mainland does not have that. And those protests basically spiraled and sometimes descended into violence and became a sort of greater rejection of moves by Beijing to steadily erode Hong Kong's freedom and the promise that one day it would also be able to elect its own leaders. Coronavirus has obviously dampened that a little bit this year, but the anger is still there. It's very palpable. And, I really think that Beijing does not want to see an explosion of anger in Hong Kong streets again. So they're trying to essentially use every tool in their toolbox to make sure that doesn't happen again. And the national security law is for sure a part of that.
So, Shibani, what impact could this have, this new national security law, on the relationship between the United States and China?
Yeah, I think the really stunning thing about the way that this was implemented is that it essentially skipped all mechanisms here in Hong Kong. It is very, very unusual that Beijing would just implement a law that is this consequential, but by decree, without using the Hong Kong's chief executive or Hong Kong's legislature. And to many observers, that seems like basically the end of one country, two systems, the framework that Hong Kong was supposed to operate under till 2047. It's supposed to be guaranteed autonomy. It's supposed to be guaranteed, freedoms, including freedoms of the press, the right to stand for election on a platform that opposes the government and even opposes Beijing. And so, the issue for Washington, I think, is how to respond to this, especially amid, ongoing rivalry between the U.S. and China. We noted that Secretary of State Pompeo's statements was very, very strong on this. He actually characterized this as the death knell for one country, two systems and for autonomy in Hong Kong. Hong Kong operates under a special relationship with the United States. It is not subject to the same sort of trade controls and restrictions that are applied to mainland China. And if that were to go away, it would have seismic impact for business here and for, even just broader, geopolitical relations.
So then what is going to happen next with this law?
What's going to happen next is that we're probably going to see this being passed by, China's Rubber Stamp Council in the next few days. Already, you're seeing calls for protests. You're seeing activists mobilize. I think it's going to be a little bit hard for them to get the numbers that they had last year, especially considering the restrictions, the social distancing measures still in place because of coronavirus. And so, we'll have to see how people respond, whether they're going to go out to the streets, and indeed, what kind of moves come next from Washington. There is an ongoing review of the special status that Hong Kong enjoys with the United States. That report is supposed to come out soon. It was actually delayed until the United States saw what happened with Hong Kong at this annual meeting of China's legislature. So it's really going to be interesting days ahead. I think everyone is predicting a pretty eventful summer here in Hong Kong, and potentially seeing more protests on the streets and potentially more violence.
Well, it's obviously no surprise that China is determined to control Hong Kong, regardless of the opposition. I'm wondering, because as you mentioned, it is supposed to be autonomous. It is supposed to be one country with two separate systems. Is there anything that the people of Hong Kong or the city itself can do, or is the outcome really written already at this point?
Well, I think the way that Beijing implemented this national security legislation shows that precisely that they can pretty much just do whatever they want. They have been making some very unconstitutional moves in recent weeks, and moving to undermine that framework under which Hong Kong operates. But I think all observers have just been kind of shocked at the boldness and the high risk involved in this move. It's almost like they did it without even really factoring in the international condemnation and the potential change with Hong Kong's status. And I think that's really shocked many people and really showed them that, if Beijing wants something in Hong Kong, they're just going to move to get it. They're just going to take it for themselves. It's not going to matter what the legislature says or does. It's not going to matter what the opposition is. They're just going to move ahead and do it. And I think, one of the main issues here is that the way China sees the protests here in Hong Kong, they see it really as, the black hand, the foreign interference, the bad actors from the West, from the United States trying to meddle in their affairs. And China's determined to sort of crush that, right? And I think as long as that's the framing, they're going to be insistent on clamping down. They simply will not tolerate having this dissent so close to their borders. And so I think Hong Kong people will certainly try to mobilize. They'll certainly try to push back. But I think this week has really been an indication that Beijing will try to get what they want here, whatever the cost.
Sure, and given how grand the protests were, the size of those protests last year were tremendous. It seems like on its own, Hong Kong won't be able to stand up to China in the repression of their rights and their sovereignty. Is the international community then the only check that really exists, and what has been the international response?
I think the protesters, the protest movement would tell you that they have long been appealing to Washington and the international community to do something, because they do see themselves as stuck between sort of David and Goliath, right? And they see themselves as needing to appeal to another superpower to kind of so-called save them from China, from Beijing. The international response has actually been quite muted, other than that coming from Washington. Obviously, Washington frames this within the broader U.S.-China rivalry. But, I have to say, too, that the spirit of Hong Kong people has always struck me. There have been so many points last year where we simply thought, that there's no way people are going to come out now. That past police action was too brutal. It was too scary. Surely now they will be disincentivized, right? Surely now they'll be scared. Surely now they'll be tired. Surely after 6 months of fight, they're just exhausted and they don't want to do it anymore. But they've surprised and shocked us sort of at every turn. So, I wouldn't underestimate too their ability to fight back. But there's just so many more tools now that can be used against them, right? With this national security law when it comes into place, with these social distancing restrictions over coronavirus, and with all the existing laws that have seen, thousands of protesters be arrested, in the 8 months of unrest last year, right? So, I think it's a pretty bleak, environment here, I think.
Well, On that note, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it a bit. Shibani Mahtani, thank you for joining us. Rena, I'm going to send it back over to you.
Thank you so much.